Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today I'm gonna try get through my thoughts on the 28 core 5 gigahertz demo that Intel did at Computex. This video has been an absolute nightmare so far. I've tried to record it for so many attempts, and I just never come out with something that I like. So here goes nothing. I don't like the amount of information that the demo provided, okay? Because Intel basically seems to Intel has been very tight-lipped about how they ran the demo, and that makes it really hard to figure out like if what they were doing was even remotely realistic. Right now I'm going with it wasn't. It definitely wasn't even remotely realistic. And quite frankly, I would have preferred, from an information perspective, if they ran the demo on liquid nitrogen, it would have yielded more useful information for me than what they actually did with the water chiller. Because there's conflicting report, like Steve from Gamers Nexus says that he heard from some other people that the who actually had better access to the water chiller and the Intel demo, that water chiller was actually like the CPU was idling at -10, and that the water temperature was actually -20, and it wasn't anywhere near the sort of retail spec for that water chiller, which kind of, to me, that makes sense because those Halia aquarium chillers, which is what Intel used, they are apparent that there's pretty basic mod guides to get those things to go below 0. Now, I'm not sure how much harder it would be to get it all the way down to -20, but if that water chiller belongs to, say, Gigabyte's R&D lab, I would not be surprised if it did -20, honestly. Like, that's just, that would be... Honestly, I think it'd be more surprising if it didn't do -20 at that point. But then AnandTech, and if you go by retail spec for that water chiller, it maxes out at 4 degrees Celsius. Nonetheless, it has a cooling capacity of 1700 watts. So it is quite the chiller. And it's, so it's quite large, but basically there's a problem with the temperature because Intel won't officially disclose what temperature they actually had the system at. I will note that I think the amount of insulation they had on the system for 4 degrees Celsius seems a little bit excessive. And as I said before, if that chiller belongs to Gigabyte, because Gigabyte, the demo system that did 5 gigahertz, that was on the Gigabyte motherboard. If that chiller belongs to Gigabyte, it doing -20 would not be even remotely surprising. So that's a big problem because -20 is just this oddball sort of coolant temperature where it's like there's not a lot of data for that. Because people who have a 7980XE and are willing to go that far usually go all the way to liquid nitrogen. Like they skip the chiller and just go really cold. And then people who do have chillers don't tend to go into the extreme, like off the deep end where it's like water and ice forming freaking everywhere, because it's not just about modifying the chiller. At that point, you're talking about how do you make sure that it doesn't kill your $500 motherboard, and when your motherboard shorts out, will it take the CPU with it? That's a very real problem. If you get if the water gets into a certain area of the motherboard, your motherboard might decide, hey, it'd be really funny if the CPU got 5 volts instead of 2, or 2 volts on the VCCS. Like it just, water on certain parts of the motherboard just it can very quickly lead to a dead CPU. So, and water chillers are actually extremely good at sort of building up water without actually building up ice. Ice is fine. Ice is non-conductive. You don't have to worry about ice buildup. Water buildup is the worst thing ever. So a lot of people who do run chilled water loops, they don't push them that low. So there's no real, like, there's not, and also the other thing is people who do run chilled water loops, like the documentation for the various chips out there is like, there's a 7980XE that I suspect was run at -10 degrees water temperature. I just have no proof of it because the owner of the chip didn't actually specify what temperature they ran at. And then there are some other chips where it's like, oh, this one was run at 6 degrees. And then there's some where it was like 15 degrees water temperature. And again, as soon as you're like minus 20 versus 6 degrees, massive difference. So basically, there's no comparison points for Intel's cooling, right? You don't have solid comparison points. So useless. If they ran on liquid nitrogen and the chip did 5.5 gigahertz on liquid nitrogen, we could say that, okay, across the board, this CPU should clock at least 300 megahertz lower, possibly worse. Okay, because 5.8 gigahertz, like 5.5 to 5.8 is currently the range of what a 7980XE will hit on liquid nitrogen. I mean, sometimes 5.4 depends on the benchmark, but basically you're sort of looking 5.4 to 5.8. So if Intel's Uberbind demo chip did 5.5, you know that it's probably about 300 megahertz worse than a 7980XE across the board. Which would be very, very, that'd be very easy to work with, but no, Intel ran their silly water chiller. So that makes a cooling situation just like, I don't bloody know. Next point, the frequency and how much power it probably pulled. So from my reading, like my looking into how much voltage you need for Cinebench to pass at 5 gigahertz for 7980XEs, 7940Xs, 7960Xs, you're looking at around 1.4 volts. Some chips will do it at like 1.3, and some chips will do it at more, but around 1.4 volts is where you can run 5 gigahertz for most of these without using subambient cooling. The problem being subambient cooling actually raises your frequency range, because the colder your transistors run, the more efficient they get, the higher frequencies you can push them to. That's why, like, if you actually looked into overclocking the Extreme Edition CPUs, it's really not so much about the voltage, it's all about the temperature. Because you can't push that much voltage into these things, they get way too damn hot. So basically, it looks like, so 5 gigahertz, for the existing chips, you're looking at around 1.4 volts. Intel's chip is at minus 20. Water temperature. So who knows? And it might have still been on 1.4 volts. In which case, 1.4 volts, 5 gigahertz, you're probably talking around 1100 watts to 1400 watts of power consumption. Okay, 1400 watts would be the high end. They'd actually have to probably go past 1.4 volts for that, which I don't think they would have had the cooling for. 1100 watts would have been under 1.4 volts V-core. Really hard to say. Intel didn't release voltage numbers, but that's sort of the range I'd reasonably expect it to hit. Now, the thing is, so, that power consumption sounds already insane, but the thing is, Cinebench is actually a lot less power hungry than something like Prime 95, or really any kind of proper stress test that uses AVX. And if you look at least liquid nitrogen numbers and actually water cooling numbers, if you start running AVX accelerated workloads compared to Cinebench, you're going to lose like 300 to 200 megahertz. 200 to 300 megahertz compared to the Cinebench when you're talking about, the high-end desktop, high core count CPUs. So the 14 core, 16 core, 18 core. You lose about 300, 200 megahertz if you go from Cinebench to Prime 95 because of cooling issues, as well as voltage issues, as well as just the power consumption. Like Prime 95, harder to stabilize. You need more voltage to run it stable, and more voltage means bigger cooling problem, and it already pulls more power for any given voltage. So you're just completely screwed, and you lose frequency going from that to that. So if Intel, ran their demo with a Prime 95 test and not just Cinebench, I wouldn't have been like, it would have probably only done like 4.7, 4.8, maybe less, because we don't know where the power consumption was, right? Because we don't know where the voltage was at. We don't know what kind of temperatures the CPU was hitting under load. There was very little information, but basically, I think if they were doing 5 gigahertz Cinebench, I'd be inclined to believe that chip would not do would do 4.8, maybe even as low as 4.6 for Prime 95, because the heat load would make a big difference there, I feel like. So, but still, I'd say 4.8 is the likelier one of the two. 4.6 would be kind of weird. I think it'd be too much of a drop, but 4.8 I think would be reasonable. Though the other issue is Cinebench on a 28 core 5 gigahertz CPU finishes extremely fast. And if you actually ran a real workload or Cinebench over and over and over and over and over and over again, you might actually find out that after 20 runs of Cinebench in succession, you're not actually stable. If you ran like a minute of Prime 95 or, minute and a half, it would actually crash sooner. So it might not have even been like Cinebench bulletproof stability. It would have been just like Cinebench, we can run this at the demo with decent confidence that it won't crash when we press the run button. Which, like... That's like, on one hand, you'd be sitting there going like, but that seems like a really bad idea to go up on stage with a system that has a 1 in 20 chance, or maybe one. Well, you'd have like successive gives you heat buildup, so if it was successive, you'd actually see like that actually has an impact on your stability as well. But I don't know. Maybe they had like a 1% chance of the system crashing, and so they would have gone with it. But 1% chance of Cinebench crashing is like 99% chance that Prime 95 won't run for more than a minute, right? Like, big difference in your stability right there. You can pass Cinebench at settings that are absolute nowhere even near stable for Prime 95. So basically, we don't actually know that the CPU does 5 gigahertz. We just sort of have Intel saying that it does. And even if they had enough voltage for Prime 95, it might have been uncoolable, and that would have still caused it to crash. So I wouldn't. So for like the first thing I'm sort of disliking is I don't really buy the 5 gigahertz 28 core thing. I'm not buying it. I don't think that chip was actually 5 gigahertz fully stable. Okay. Which, again, like if they ran an LN2 demo, I would have been fine with that. If they did an LN2 demo and the chip did 5.6 gigahertz on LN2 or 5.5 or whatever it did on LN2 for Cinebench, I would have said that's a great demo, because that's comparable to what we've done, plenty of data to the 7980XE. But either way, so that's one issue. And the thing is, then you sort of... So basically, based on that, if you go, okay, so we're going to chop off, maybe 100, 200 megahertz for Prime 95 stability. And then you go and you take out the chiller, which with the chiller you need to take out a ton of voltage. Because, again, these chips run stupid hot. And you end up with something like honestly, if Intel went and took that 28-core demo chip they had and they ran it on like regular water cooling, I'd be very surprised if it did much above 4.2 gigahertz stable, like Prime 95 stable. I think it would have passed like 4.5 gigahertz Cinebench, or maybe even 4.6 Cinebench. But the thing is, minus 20, like, because I know, like, if you go from, because if you have like ambient water on 7940X, 7980XE, right, where it's like 30-degree water, you're going to do, say, 4.8 gigahertz. And then if you drop that water temperature from 30 to 10, you can do 5. And if you go from, and if you assume that scaling still holds, going from 10 to minus 20, you'd expect to do like 5.1, 5.2 Cinebench. And at that point, it's like, well, if you saw that same kind of scale, so, you're looking at like 400 megahertz difference between minus 20 and positive there. And it's just like, well, so if they did a 5 gigahertz demo on minus 20 and they did a water-cooled demo, then it would have been like 4.6 gigahertz Cinebench, 4.4 gigahertz Prime 95, which is still a respectable clock speed. Don't get me wrong, for a 28-core 4.4 gigahertz, that's insane. Though, keep in mind your power consumption. Gamers Nexus has Blender AVX rendering power consumption for a 7980XE at 1.175 volts, 4.5 gigahertz, and that chip pulls 500 watts doing that. Okay, and if you scale that up to the 28 core, which the 28 core is basically 55% more cores than the 18 core, you're looking at like 750 watts of power consumption. Going from the 18 core to the 28 core, assuming for a given frequency and a given voltage, right? You're just going to get 55% more power consumption. So then again, it's like, will you be cooling limited? Because with that much more power consumption, if you're cooling limited, you're going to have to back off the frequency again. So 4.4 gigahertz, Prime 95 stable is like, might be possible. But the other question is, how many CPUs did Intel bin before they found one to do their 5 gigahertz demo with? Right? That's the other issue, is like, how many of these chips actually do 5 gigahertz? How many did you need to bin? Because there's a pretty big spread between like excellent CPUs and god-awful CPUs. It's easily around 400 megahertz for any generation of Intel CPU. You know, you go from like, there were some generations where it was a lot worse. Like you had absolute rocks and then gem chips, which were like 600 megahertz apart. But more recently, Intel's been getting a bit more consistent. So, but even then, if you look at like Coffee Lake, a rock is 4.9 and a gem is 5.3 at the same voltage, which is just like, that's 400 megahertz right there. So if this is a top, if this is a top 10, top 5% CPU that they're running with, then the average would be like 4.2 gigahertz for these 28 cores, which is just like, well, that is, that's going to be, that I would say is, that would be realistic for water cooling, in my opinion. And it might, and it would still be at around that 1.175 volts, right? Because if we're assuming that this maintains, like, yeah, so that's, like, honestly, I think if they just took the current chips they have, the current Skylake Xeons, the 28-core Xeons, unlocked them and unleashed them on the market, and people started overclocking them, we would probably find that they land around 4.2 gigahertz, with, say, 4.4 on some, like, top bin chips would be like 4.4, maybe even 4.5, and then the garbage chips would be like 4.1 for AVX workloads after delidding with like a full custom water loop, and you would be looking at a power consumption between sort of 600 and maybe 900 watts, right? Like, another thing is maybe the bigger die would actually prove to be easier to cool, but then the flip side to the bigger die is you end up with, like, with 28 cores, there's a bunch of cores right in the middle of the die which are surrounded by other cores. So those cores would run really, really hot, and you already kind of have that going on with the 18 core, where there's like 6 cores right in the middle of the chip, which must be, like, those cores are going to be the hottest ones on the chip. But if you look at the 28 core, like, there's 16, like, I think it's like 12 or 16 cores right in the middle of the die that are getting absolutely cooked. So, thermals might be, like, thermals would lower the clock speed again, but realistically, I think if they took the Skylake Xeons, you'd be looking at around 4.2. Because the other thing is the Skylake Xeons ship at like 2.5 gigahertz stock. And let me just pull up my power draw little power draw calculator that I have. It's not good for this. Like, this is actually really misusing it, what I'm going to do, because I don't know how much stock voltage the Xeons run on. And if I had the stock voltage, then it'd be reasonably accurate. But since I don't, it's just like, I don't bloody know what it'll do. Where did I put the damn thing? Alright, I'm in the wrong folder. But, if we just, like, I'm gonna give Intel the benefit of the doubt and say that the Xeons run on a relatively high 0.8 volts for 2500 megahertz. That seems to me pretty damn high for how low a frequency that is. The stock TDP for these things is 205 watts. If we set the OC voltage to 1.175, and then OC clock to 4400, oh, we end up with 7980XE numbers. So I can't be too far off then, because it says 780 watts of power consumption for 4.4 at 1.175, which is about in line with the, if you scale up at 7980XE, then you end up with around 750. So, very similar in that sense, but I'm not sure that the Xeons run on such a high voltage. If the Xeons that Intel makes right now run on 0.6, then 1.175 at 4.4 gigahertz would translate to 1400 watts of power consumption, which is way more. Though that would also mean the demo would be, like, they would have had to bin like crazy to find a chip that good. So, yeah, it'd be really nice if I knew the stock voltage for those damn Xeons. If they were on 0.75 volts average, then you'd be looking at like 900 watts for 4.4. Which, that would still be kind of... which that'd be 900 watts for AVX workloads. So that would still, I think, be kind of realistic. Yeah, I'd call that pretty realistic. But yeah, so basically, if they scaled up the current Xeons, you'd be looking 4.2, 4.4, massive, stupid amounts of power consumption. And yeah, it would just be, it would be really slow. Like that 5 gigahertz demo is just so out there, in terms of yeah, it's just way out there. So realistically, I think if they took what they have now, you'd see like 4.2, 4.4. Maybe even less than that, but I don't want to sound like, personally, I think it's around 4.2. Okay, where it would average out. But the other thing, the thing is, there's a lot of people who have like I've seen a lot of people who are like, oh, these 28 cores are going to do 4.5. 7980XEs have a relatively hard time doing 4.5 Prime 95 stable. I don't think the 28 core would get even close to that, because you have more cores causing thermal issues, more cores causing power delivery issues, which the fully integrated voltage regulator actually does an excellent job of dealing with that. But more cores power issues, more core thermal issues, and more cores silicon quality issues. Like, the probability that all 28 of your cores are going to be great is really, really unlikely compared to the probability of your 18 cores being great, which is already really, like, very unlikely compared to, like, your quad cores, right? Which Lake chips would peak at, like, an average Lake was like 5 gigahertz. The average Skylake-X is like, well, you can't run a Skylake-X on the same voltage as you can run a Lake in the first place. So that already just completely just, like you lose a lot of your frequency just to the thermals here. And the 28 core would just make that issue worse. And the other thing, like, I'm not sure that, because with most custom water loops, the water blocks sort of top out around 500 watts. Like, you try to push more than 500 watts into the water block on ambient water cooling, and, like, it's just impossible. Maybe with liquid metal between the, like, everywhere, or direct dye liquid metal, you could, but generally speaking, very hard. Very, very hard to push more than 500 watts into a custom water cooling loop, because at that point you're not, like, the problem is not the size of your loop, it's just the heat doesn't get out of the silicon fast enough into the loop. So yeah, but anyway, so let's just say, the 4.2 gigahertz is the average. Intel said they're going to work on this. Intel said they're going to optimize the manufacturing process. They're going to make it better so that Cascadelake-X is not exactly like Skylake-X Xeons, 28 core Xeons, because there's also 18 core Xeons. So distinction worth making. But the thing with that is, Intel's been refining their 14 nanometer process for ages now, right? Remember Broadwell? Broadwell sucked. Broadwell tops out around 4.4 gigahertz. And then if you looked at, like, the Broadwell E chips, you're looking like 4.2, 4.3 average, and 4.4 is really good, and 4.5 is like unicorn chips, right? Though they do exist, and not Prime 95 stable. We're talking like 4.5 gigahertz Cinebench. Those are unicorns on water cooling. But so that was Broadwell E, and Broadwell kind of sucked in the clock department. And then Intel comes out with Skylake and a revised 14 nanometer process, and Skylake does 4.6 to 4.8 gigahertz on the regular. Some Rock chips are like 4.5. Some Gem chips would go all the way up to, say, 5. But on the same voltage. And then from Skylake, we move on to Lake. Lake adds another sort of 300 megahertz on top of that. So you go from, like, 4.6 to 4.8, you go to, like, 4.9 to 5.1, and then we get Coffee Lake, and Coffee Lake moves it up by 100 megahertz. We go from 5 to 5.2-ish. The problem, the thing I'm trying to point out is that Coffee Lake to Coffee Lake, not a big jump, not a big improvement. And I think Intel's kind of hit the limit of what they're able to optimize. Okay, I don't really like. I'd be very, very surprised if they managed to squeeze out more than 100 megahertz for any given voltage, if even that. It might be that they just get the power consumption down. Like, that would already be a pretty good optimization to do, is just like make it pull less power, because if they launch the current Skylakes as 28 cores, it would just be stupid power hungry. Because the 18 core is already stupid power hungry, right? And then it's like, oh yeah, let's smack 10 more cores onto that. This is totally not going to make that a bigger problem. So yeah, even after the refinements, I'd still think these things would top out around 4.3 to 4, like average would be like 4.3, 4.4. But assuming you don't run into a massive cooling problem, which you could, because I don't know, maybe with the, because the chips have a bigger heat spreader, so with a bigger water block, bigger die, right? Bigger die, bigger heat spreader, bigger water block, you might be able to transfer 700 watts of heat, maybe. I'm not entirely sure. Cool, like that level of cooling design, really not, not really my expertise, but it's just, I'm like, if it's still topped out at the 500 watt, 600 watt sort of power draw limit that we have for the existing Skylake-X's, which it shouldn't, like the die's bigger, it should be able to push more power. But, if it topped out around there, then you'd be looking at like 4 gigahertz, because the power consumption would be just way beyond any cooling capacity. Though, incidentally, assuming your water block was able to transfer 800 watts from the CPU to the water loop, your water loop would need like 2 480 millimeter radiators. Yeah, Intel's 5 gigahertz demo is just out there. Like, it is completely unrealistic as far as I'm concerned. And it did a good job of building hype, that's for sure. But I think when Cascadelake-X actually comes around, you're going to find out that these chips clock even worse than the existing 7980XE. And the 7980XE already clocks pretty badly. Okay, let's just be honest about it. It clocks pretty low. And why? It's huge. It's very hot. It's a nightmare to cool. And so, you just take all of those problems that the 7980XE has and you make them bigger, because you've just made it a 28 core, and then you've done some optimizations to make it clock a tad higher. I'm saying that a 28 core, even from Intel, like Intel's 14 nanometer process is incredible in terms of how far it can clock. It's not power efficient though. And that's a real problem, because these, like, Skylake-X isn't voltage limited, right? You can, technically speaking, shove 1.4 volts into a Skylake-X chip and it would survive that. The bigger problem is you can't cool that. And when they make the 28 core, you're going to go from 1.3 volts being uncoolable to 1.15 volts being uncoolable, or you're going to end up with a lot less voltage range. So the frequency is going to be quite possibly massively reduced. And I think, because, and the reason why I'm basically saying this is because I did see quite a few people out there, in comment sections going like, ooh, Intel has a 5 gigahertz Cinebench demo, these chips are going to do 4.5 on water. Nah, they won't. Because, like, the 7980XE under, I think, a similarly binned 7980XE on a similar cooling system would clock about 200 megahertz higher than what Intel demoed, and that chip still wouldn't do more than 4.6, 4.7 on water cooling for daily. So, yeah. It's like, it was a cool demo. Don't get me wrong, I think it's cool that they got 5 gigahertz running for even Cinebench, but as far as being indicative of any product that Intel plans to produce, no, absolutely not. Like, it's too cold to be compared against basically anything. Like, it's right in that temperature range where it's like, it's not cold enough to compare to liquid nitrogen, and it's far too cold to compare it to water cooling. And we don't know how much binning happened. We don't know what voltage it ran on. We don't know anything. And it finished Cinebench, not Prime 95, not, you know, it didn't do an actual heavy workload. It did freaking Cinebench. So yeah, that's basically my thoughts on the 28 core. I think it'll still be an interesting CPU. It'll be extremely expensive just because Intel's already, like, these 28 core Xeons that they have, they charge what, $10,000? Like, they're around the $10,000 mark per chip. So Intel will, you know, take the ECC, like, assuming Intel wants it to compete with Threadripper, even remotely, they'll probably aim around $3,000 to $5,000 a chip. And at that point, you're going to lose. There's not going to be any ECC. There's not going to be multi-socket support. Like, Intel's not insane. They're not going to give up their ability to charge $10,000 for a CPU that has multi-socket support. There's just no way. So, you know, like, and I wouldn't be surprised if the 28 core was $5,000 at all. But basically, you know, you'd lose the, like, they'd take ECC off because they've already done that for, I think they've already done that for Skylake-X chips. They'd disable the ability to, like, the QPI link would be gone. You wouldn't be allowed to put two of these into a board. That would completely undermine the rest of the Xeon lineup. And it would still be extremely expensive. And it wouldn't clock very high. I think what Intel could do as far as the clocks go is maybe set a really high turbo clock, but for like 1 or 2 cores on the chip, but they will, like, the whole chip doing much more than 4, like, doing significant, like, more than 4.5, I think is really unlikely. Like, extremely unlikely, because that 5 gigahertz demo was just, like, fine-tuned to be very light in terms of CPU workload, very cold, and just generally kind of uninformative. So I'm going to say I'm very, very, very skeptical about these chips doing 4.5. I'd say, you know, even after the revisions, 4.3, 4.2, 4.3, 4.4 is where I'd expect them to land for AVX workloads. So, and that's assuming you don't have a cooling problem, because I think you will have a cooling problem, and that might drive it down further. So, okay, well, this video is now way too damn long, and that pretty much covers all of my thoughts on that. It's going to be expensive. It's not going to clock as high as people think. I think it'll honestly, like, I don't know how Threadripper, the 32-core Threadripper will clock, and that's going to be, I plan to do a separate video on, like, my thoughts on the 32-core Threadripper. Yay, I'm now doing theoretical clickbait videos. I feel like I really don't like this video. Like, this one already, it's just like, it's all speculation, and I don't like doing that. But I've had so many people ask me on like the recent live streams I've done. I've had so many people ask me about my thoughts on the 28 core Intel chip that, well, here's my bloody thoughts. It's a lot of speculation because Intel's demo was freaking useless. They showed nothing. Okay, well, nothing that you can extrapolate from with any reasonable amount of accuracy. So, yeah, but that's my thoughts. I will be doing a similar, well, hopefully a less crappy video about the 32-core Threadripper sometime soon. I hope to interleave that between some actual real content. I don't like doing videos like this. But, yeah, hot, low clock, very power hungry, very expensive, and but still cool. Like, I still think it would be a cool CPU, especially if the Intel puts the 20, like, if somebody puts that 28 core, the Cascadelake-X chip on liquid nitrogen, I think that'll be really exciting to see. From a sort of how the hell will the motherboard survive that perspective, but the practical applications and the like the price performance of this 28 core CPU, even with all the revisions that Intel plans to do, it's gonna be awful. It's gonna be just awful. Like you can't just keep adding cores, okay? Like, there's a price you pay for adding cores, and it's called clock, and it's basically clock speed, and we've seen that across every Intel CPU generation. Like, just look at Devil's Canyon versus Haswell E, right? Or Sandy Bridge versus Sandy Bridge E, or well, Broadwell versus Broadwell doesn't work because there's no Broadwells out there. I mean, they did exist, but you get the idea. Well, Skylake versus Skylake-X. Or, well, you should compare Lake versus Skylake-X, because Lake is on the same process as Skylake-X, whereas Skylake is like an older process than Skylake-X. So I don't like that naming scheme at all. But anyway, yeah, those are my thoughts. At this point, I'll actually finish the video. Thank you for watching. If you didn't like the video, tell me so that I don't have to like stress out of doing the next one. And just go back to doing VRM stuff. And yeah, that's it. And thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon and PayPal. There's t-shirts you can buy. You can find a link to all of that down in the description below. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.